Back to basics, the rise of minimal phones. In the last few years, what's old is new again. Dumb phones are making a comeback, labeled as minimal phones. Some have a version of Android that essentially strips anything that takes a ton of processing power. Others have their own OS with very minimal apps and no app store to boot. And some come with an e-ink display of sorts, all resulting in a phone with no entertainment but days of usage. The question of what dictates a phone as minimal is an interesting one. From what I can tell, this push for minimalism started more so with the younger Gen Y and Gen Z crowds, as they saw how screen time can be detrimental to their mental health. What stemmed from that is a movement of users wanting something different from their devices, something that goes back to its roots with the basics: calls, texts, email, clock, time arm, notes, and a calendar. However, some options offer updated apps and features: maps and directions, music, podcasts, audiobooks, removable batteries, and possibly even a camera and web browser. Other forms of entertainment or social media are not included. The popular saying, "There's an app for that," has no meaning in the minimalist world either. There are a few major players in this space if this sounds like a venture you'd like to explore. The light phone and the minimal phone are very popular and have great options with various features. If you want to go extremely basic, the Punk'd phone can do that. Although you may think you're on an episode of Punk'd if you use it. A brand you're probably more familiar with gets a bit closer to a smartphone, the Nokia 225. All of these options are also used by some who already have a smartphone and simply swap their SIM cards out when wanting to be a bit more off the grid. Others use these as their main phone and supplement them with a tablet or laptop. Others even use a typical smartphone, but one that is not hooked up to a phone number, and use it for essentially everything but making phone calls. With these options requiring Wi-Fi to be fully functional, screen time and use can be minimized and/or limited. On the other hand, there is a smaller crowd pushing for minimalist setups on a standard iPhone or Android in hopes of prolonging their battery life as they use it less and less. There are a few tips here that may come in handy if this sounds like something you'd be interested in. Ultimately, it may come down to self-control, limiting yourself, possibly even through an app, or setting up positive distractions that help minimize use and total screen time. Two of the biggest tips for saving battery life are to use low power mode and disable cellular data for apps that aren't used frequently or that don't need internet access 24/7. This keeps your phone from hitting your mobile service provider, AT&T or Verizon, for example, for background app refresh settings. Although it may be minor for one app, it can add up for multiple apps. It can also help minimize data used on your plan. For another example, one of the simplest things you can do before changing anything else is simply using your phone in grayscale mode. On iOS at least, you can also set the back tap, triple press the Siri button, or the newly installed Action button to switch back and forth as needed. There are a few other ways to do this too. Here are 7 ways to turn grayscale on or off on Android. The thought process here, psychologically, is that the loss of color makes your phone and apps less tempting. And it typically works well. Something I've done more recently to minimize and organize my home screen layout is to use more and more widgets. They take up more space on the screen and have minimal functions. This means there are fewer apps on the screen to click on, and with minimal functions, fewer reasons to open the apps, unless I want to be intentional towards some action. Another tip regarding smartphone setups for minimalism is to download apps that help change the home screen layout to limit apps on the home screen. There are plenty of examples, but the two I'll share go by the same name, even though they are different developers. Consider downloading the Minimalist Launcher on iOS or Android. These typically function as widgets, so there is also a lot of customization here. Another way to limit access or minimize apps is to set up assistive access on iPhone. There are some very nuanced issues here, only being able to reply to text of contacts you whitelist, for example, but the layout of the device is very useful, and it helps with battery life. Personally, I suggest most should probably stray from having a minimal phone as a specific device unless you know exactly what you're getting yourself into and you're okay with it. For most, I'd bet there are plenty of reasons to keep a smartphone. For example, my phone doubles as my main camera. I don't own any other camera or video recording device. It is probably the main use of my phone, other than a web browser or search. I've talked before about this being the exact reason I upgrade my phone every few years too. That said, there are very nuanced reasons why many would still need smartphones. If someone is in the Apple ecosystem, the Find My network is very helpful, as is FaceTime, Apple Pay, and more. Similarly, with Google and Android, consider security cameras for the house, travel apps when on the road, airlines and hotels, personal finance apps, restaurant apps, specific niche work apps, health and fitness, among many, many others. A last tip to help make your phone less appealing is to use a matte screen protector. If you want to dive a bit deeper into this area, you can read Cal Newport's book, Digital Minimalism. And if you don't think you have enough self-control to limit yourself as much as you'd like, consider an app that functions similar to Screen Time, but way more in your face. Opal, Screen Time for Focus, or the Burnout Buddy, Screen Time and App Blocker. If you'd like a desktop version that helps keep social media from being a distraction, consider Social Focus. What are your non-negotiable apps to keep you from giving up your smartphone?